session of the Volunteer Engagement webinar series. We're going to be focusing on volunteer leadership development. Sorry, I had a little voice in my head. But I just want to thank everybody for the understanding postponing this webinar from last month to this month, and I appreciate some of you who checked in on me. Everything was fine, you know, nothing too traumatic was going on, just I wasn't able to prepare myself well enough to give you all the information, and I want to make sure that I'm on top of my game when we talk about these things, so that way I'm not wasting your time and we're getting some valuable information. So thank you all for understanding that. I also wanted to remind everyone to mute themselves if you haven't already. As I get feedback, I will likely mute you, not trying to be rude or anything, just reducing that background noise. And as always, when we do these series, anything that is recommended as best practice or that we discuss as the group is not required for you to implement in your volunteer program in any way, shape, or form. These are just recommendations, and if you see anything or hear anything that you like that you want to try and implement in your programs in your area, make sure that you talk with your supervisor and upper management to make sure everyone's on board. And with that, I'm super excited to talk about volunteer leadership development today. This was a really exciting topic in research, and I think it's going to be a great way for us to continue to build capacity for all of our volunteer programs. So first things first, what is a volunteer leader? A volunteer leader is different from any of your volunteers that are in your general or normal volunteer roles. These volunteers are going above and beyond, and they're going to be assigned to roles to where they're leading things for potentially other volunteers. So think of them as kind of maybe your assistants or even you in certain particular roles. So for example, they're going to coordinate a project. So we have programs and we have, you know, little caveats to everything that we do. Rather than taking on all 10 tasks, maybe we're delegating one of those coordinated projects to one of our volunteers. They're going to be the point of contact for volunteers on that project and provide the resources that normally we would in our roles. I apologize if you hear any feedback from me as well or any background noise. We're back in the office full time and I'm kind of in the center of everything, so you might hear people walking around having conversations. And also the leaders they're going to lead those volunteers before, during, and after the project is over, and they're also going to use their creativity to possibly create new projects. And they're going to be representing our organization not only to other volunteers, but possibly the community, depending on our policies and procedures. We have these volunteers in many, if not all of our programs, but we may be timid or a little hesitant to put even more responsibility on the volunteers for a whole host of reasons. So if we consider taking a chance, even on a small project, to invite volunteer leaders to be more involved and take more accountability, we have the potential to see our programs grow and maybe, just maybe, relieve some of our day-to-day stresses as well. Wouldn't that be nice? So the first thing that we have to do when we're looking at getting some volunteer leaders in our programs is, just like we talked about back in June, is we have to get that buy-in from all of our organization. Sorry, getting a little feedback there. We talked about that again in June, so if you missed that webinar, that's on our YouTube channel, and we talk a lot about buy-in. But we need to be able to articulate clearly to our upper management why developing volunteer leaders is a critical part of the success of our programs, and it will increase our ability to deliver our services even more than what we already are able to. If we don't have this buy-in, it's going to be really hard to get the permissions and the resources that a volunteer leader is going to need to be successful. We have so many potential leaders in our community, from people who have retired, who are looking for ways to use the knowledge, skills, and expertise that they've accumulated throughout their lifetime and in their careers to give back to their local community. We have current professionals who want to be more involved in the community. We also have young adults who maybe are still in school and looking for opportunities to gain more experience. So the leaders are out there. We just got to find them. And we'll talk about how we do that as well. Having volunteer leaders will enable us to expand our capacity to serve more people and maybe even develop new programs or services that we can provide. Just think back on this last year that we've gone through. and how many of us have had to make adjustments and that have really benefited the people that we serve. We never thought about some of the things that we were able to create out of this pandemic. For example, My Ride, running errands for people to reduce exposure, but still making sure that the clients have what they need. New telephone reassurance programs and letter writing campaigns to help decrease the social isolation. Ooh, talking would really help. And encouraging connectedness, and programs that people, purchase groceries for other people, and so many other things. So we want to keep these programs going, right? There are new ideas. We've been able to help people in so many different ways, and of course, it's going to take money, but it's also going to take people to coordinate the efforts. As we slowly move back into how things looked pre-COVID, do we all have time to really take on these new projects? If there's no funding to hire someone to take on these projects, which there may or may not be depending, volunteer leaders are going to be our best option to continue these valuable projects that we've started. So we don't want things to go away. We want to try and be able to sustain them further on. Because we're so amazing at our jobs and we have our upper management not only on board for getting the volunteer leaders, but they're beyond excited for the opportunity because we're awesome and we're able to articulate just like we talked about. Now we have to make sure other staff members are ready for volunteers or groups of volunteers possibly to come into the office more regularly. Potentially if you're back in the office, some of us are still working remotely, so maybe having that remote access as well. And also have access to the resources in that non-leadership role volunteers typically don't have access to. So maybe some more inner workings on budgets and things of that nature that usually our volunteers who maybe deliver a meal or give a ride don't necessarily have access to. So be sure that you work with your supervisor and your legal staff to make sure policies and procedures are in place. Is going to be a key component in safeguarding any information that needs to be shared and having everyone understand one another's roles. So share any new developments for volunteer leaders with staff at meetings that you have. Definitely talk one-on-one with specific staff who are going to have more interaction with those volunteer leaders than maybe anyone else, so maybe a particular department depending on what that role is going to be. And be sure when volunteer leaders' activity starts to personally take them around to introduce them to key staff so everyone can kind of put a face with a name and know everyone who's going to be working together and kind of build that community that we're all going to come together for that common goal or mission. Instead of who's this random person coming into the office, they're going to know who the volunteers are and really get to know them. So we also need to do kind of a personal assessment or a needs assessment. I know that's a trigger word for some of us, but maybe a better way to put it is, a program deep dive or just a program review. Sorry, we're getting some feedback. So when we decide to find volunteer leaders for a project or a program, remember it doesn't have to be a long-term commitment necessarily. These volunteers don't have to stay around for years and years. Maybe we need someone for an event. That's, you start planning a couple months beforehand. They're there for the planning, they're there for the implementation, and maybe they're there for a couple weeks afterwards for an evaluation or a fundraiser of some kind. There may be a need for a long-term commitment as well, but we will not know or be able to determine how long the service is going to be until we do that needs assessment of our program. So we have to ask ourselves the tough questions, which are not always fun to do. These aren't just simple yes or no's or one sentence answers necessarily if we kind of do a workshop, but really to determine how the volunteer is going to take on that leadership role and be more than just any other roles that you have. So consider asking yourself things like this. What are the goals of the program? Can we meet these goals with existing staff? If we can, great. If we can't, why or why not? How do we want to expand the work that we do? And we may know some of these answers already with some of the new programs that we talked about earlier. What types of volunteer projects do we want to undertake? How can the volunteer leader improve our current work, take on new projects, or accomplish any of our goals? And what specifically can the volunteer leader do to fulfill a need that we have? So really drilling down and being very specific about what we want these volunteer leaders or leader to do. This all goes back to everything that I know I drill this into all of these sessions, but really have to focus on those volunteer role descriptions or job descriptions, whatever you want to call them. I like to call them the role descriptions. But just like any other volunteer opportunity, the leaders need a role description so they know and understand what is expected of them. So here's just a brief reminder of some of the main components for our role descriptions. I know you guys already know this and can probably close your eyes and recite all of these things to me as we talk about them all the time, but they need a title. I remember back a few months ago, Keita Cole at the beginning of the year did a presentation on some volunteer recruitments, and in her research, volunteers don't like to be called volunteers. So now's the time that we can really, as volunteer leaders come in, really use our creativity, even get their input on maybe what their title would want to be. The purpose of their role, their duties and responsibilities, who their supervisor is going to be, likely you. If there's a location or a schedule, especially if there's an event, they need to know where they need to be, their time commitment, the skills they need, any training or support we're going to provide, and any benefits. Now, benefits always gets people to kind of scratch their head, but benefits can be things like mileage reimbursements, a T-shirt because they're the event coordinator. If they purchase anything for the event, that they can be reimbursed, something along those lines. It's not necessarily, it's not a salary or anything of that nature. But don't shy away from looking for a higher level of knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we really need to look at people who have a specific skill set for some of our leadership roles. One example that might sometimes we might look at as a regular volunteer role and not a leadership role, but is our board of directors. They're very much so a volunteer leader of our organizations. Now, some of us have boards or commissions that are appointed, so we don't really actively recruit members of our boards or commissions. However, some of our senior centers, for example, have board members that they can nominate and they actively look to the community to recruit. This is a huge volunteer leader role. We don't have to fill every board member seat every year, unless, of course, your bylaws say something different. But generally speaking, per bylaws, you don't have to fill every seat every year, as long as you have a maximum number of seats. So my point is, you really need someone, if you're looking for a board, for example, or you're looking for a fundraising event, you really need to look for someone with fundraising experience or fiscal management, event planning, something like that. And we really need to be patient as we look for volunteer leaders. And that's really hard for us. And I'm probably going to drill this home a little bit too much on this session. But patience is going to be a virtue when we're looking for the right person to take on a true leadership role with a lot of responsibility. Take time to find that leader, and don't settle for our classic recruitment sin that we talked about, last year, but just having that butt in a chair. Sorry, I think we had a comment come in. I'm making sure I'm not missing any questions. Okay. If you have any questions throughout, please feel free to use the chat, and then of course we'll have a Q&A here at the end as well. So recruitment. How are we going to find these people? How are we going to recruit them into our organization? Recruitment for leaders is really very similar to how we recruit our volunteers in general for any other role that we have. You have to complete that volunteer role description and ask ourselves and dig deeper, get a little bit deeper in these questions. Who will be qualified for and interested, or who's going to be qualified and interested in this position? Who's going to meet the time requirements? We talked about some people who are retired, some people who are working, and some who are still in school. If we have to have meetings during the day, maybe the professionals and the people who are in school aren't going to be key candidates for this time commitment. It might be our retired individuals. Where are we going to find these leaders? So we know we want to look for pockets of people. Where are they going to be at? What motivates them to serve? What's the best way to approach the leader? Whoop, one too far. And kind of one of the things that many of you are probably thinking about right now, but let's recruit from within. We have a fairly large pool of volunteers. As I'm looking through 8 of our programs for our volunteer impact report, we have 7,350 volunteers across the state. And that's only a percentage. I know we still have some more numbers that we can include in that. So we do have a large pool of people, and I know some of us even have our go-to volunteers who we already see as leaders. And we just need to ask them if they're willing to take on a new task or a new project. Now keep in mind, the role that they currently have, if we're asking them to take on something new, is going to have to be filled with a different volunteer. One way to drive a volunteer away from our programs is giving them too much responsibility, and that's going to lead to burnout. So if we want to look at our current pool, we have to make sure that we have another, kind of like a musical volunteers of sorts. Oh, sorry, I'm getting some feedback again. Please make sure that you all mute yourselves. New system, it's harder to find where the feedback's coming from. Okay. And it's also possible that when you approach this amazing volunteer, that they don't want to accept that new leadership role. Maybe they're comfortable in what they're already doing, which is, of course, completely fine, and they can stay where they're at, and you can find a new volunteer for that leadership role. But you never know if someone who's currently already in our programs is going to be a good volunteer leader unless we ask. If you don't have a volunteer in mind and they're not willing to take on the role, we have to focus on our targeted recruitment. So even when recruitment is targeted, different messages attract different audiences. So a professional is going to have a little bit different wording than maybe someone who's in college or a retiree or something along those lines. So some of the methods that may help in our recruitment, making a personal ask. That's going to be one of the best ways. We always talk about recruitment, that word of mouth is the most effective way to recruit new volunteers. Same thing goes with recruiting volunteer leaders. If you, a coworker, or a volunteer even, have an idea of someone who would be great, reach out directly and ask, whether that be you making the personal ask or maybe the volunteer or coworker getting a feel from the person that they think would be great, and then saying, hey, yeah, they want you to give them a call, and you kind of communicate that way. Use the internet, social media, your website, and even some volunteer opportunity sites like Volunteer Match and the new Tennessee Serves Network. That one's a big one that the First Lady's office has launched, the Tennessee Serves Network, that helps recruit volunteers for activities across the state. So if you don't have an account on Tennessee Serves Network, I would definitely encourage you to look at that in the near future. Flyers at those specific places that you want to recruit, whether that be colleges in your area, coffee shops, libraries, faith-based organizations, places like that. Use your local media, the news, the newspaper, radios. Community groups like the Lions Club, VFW, Rotary Club, those the community clubs that really focus on community service could really be great in leadership roles for us. And then we have information booths that can be at job or college fairs or any other kind of gathering spots, maybe our senior centers. So how are we going to select our volunteer leaders? Probably the hardest part for any of us, and I've kind of mentioned this a little bit already, but the hardest part, at least for me and maybe some of you, is going to be having the patience to find that volunteer leader. We have to take our time and really make sure we have the right person for our leadership roles, or it could end pretty badly. We don't want to have to go through the process all over again. We all have volunteer applications that we have our volunteers complete. If you don't, that needs to be a top priority for you to implement. I know I said, take everything, it's not required for you to take any of these best practices that we discuss. I don't think we have anyone that has this issue, but if you don't have a volunteer application for your program, that's something that definitely needs to happen very, very soon. These applications are going to be kind of our 10,000-foot view of a volunteer to see if they're going to be a good leader. Because on every application, or at least a majority of our applications, have an interest or skills section on our application that we list everything that we're looking for. And if a person checks a particular area that would be good for our leadership candidate, then we know to put that kind of application in the potential leader pile, so to speak. So if we want them to have that fundraising experience or event planning, communications, things of that nature, then we'll be able to kind of already pick from our pool that we have, or really have us maybe a special application for this volunteer leader role that really drills down on those specific skills that we're looking for. We've talked about this a lot this year in particular, but we really stressed the importance of doing better at our interviews for potential volunteers. And particularly in selecting a volunteer leader, the interview is going to be one of the most critical elements to include to find that right person. People may look great on paper, they're going to check mark all the skills and everything that we're looking for, but until we're able to sit down with them and talk about those scenario questions or their experience questions, they may say they're great at fundraising and their fundraiser was they got their family members to donate some money for their kids' fundraiser at school, which is great. That's still a great, if that's still fundraising experience, but do they have everything that we're looking for in that? If we're looking for a high level of raising money and they've raised a small amount of money, that kind of a thing. We had a comment come in, sometimes ask volunteers for a portfolio or resume depending on the position that is really helpful in assessing their skills. Absolutely, especially if maybe you want them to help you work on media. Hey, bring us some samples of some of the media content that you've done, or if you need a photographer for something, maybe they have a portfolio. Thank you, Rebecca. Excellent, excellent suggestion. Have the volunteer role description with you in your interview process. That way you can look through it together. Maybe you're recruiting a chair for your fundraiser for your program and your description says that the volunteer leader is going to be responsible for raising $15,000 for your organization. I know that's a hefty goal, but we're looking for hardcore leaders, right? And it's going to be vital that they meet this goal. And of course, you're going to help them. It's not going to be, either you raise $15,000 or you can't volunteer with us anymore. That's not how it's going to be. But letting them know up front, this is what we expect to see, and going back to that experience of raising money and kind of their experience with that. Hopefully, through all of our hard work we've put in to find these people, we'll have a good pool of potential leaders, whether that comes from within or whether we've had to look outside. On the other hand, we're going to have this great pool of people, but we may only have 1 or 2 leadership roles to fill. So we have 5 applicants, only 2 opportunities. Obviously, not all 5 people are going to be able to be put in that leadership role. But we can also keep them as volunteers and engage them to see if maybe they want to volunteer in a role that already exists or is already established. They can get more familiar with our organization and our program, and then as other opportunities come up, we can keep them in mind for the future. And hey, maybe while they're doing their activity, they're going to come up with an idea for their own project that they want to pitch to you and see how they can maybe use their creativity to expand what they're already doing. All right, we're going to build on some skills. So we've already determined the person has a set of skills that we see valuable to the leadership role. So we've interviewed them, we've gone over their portfolios and resumes and things like that. So we have our people who we've selected. So we know they already have some great skills that are valuable, but we need to start our orientation and our training even if they already have those skills. So it's going to be a bit more intensive as well. We're going to require that they likely have probably one-on-one training with us, whether that be just an individual leader or a group of leaders. Maybe it's not with us, maybe it's with a group of staff for a particular project. While you'll be doing the usual training for an orientation of this is our organization and our mission and vision, you really have to be more specific with program goals, funding sources, policies in particular, that the volunteers will have access to, and more in-depth in protocols, most likely. Kind of including them on, this is what we've done in years past, here's all the information that we have on, potential sponsors or partners and community people that we've worked with, that normally we would keep that in-house. But if we want our volunteers to help us raise money and we're looking for local partnerships and community sponsors, they're going to have access to that. So another example of this is many organizations have a board of directors that is going to be trained specifically more in depth on their roles and expectations, such as a lot of boards are required to have each member have a monetary contribution to the organization, an annual giving, or the process that they have of reviewing and approving an organization's budget or any kind of financial transactions, new grant opportunities, contracts with new providers, things of that nature. For other projects like organizing a fundraiser event, there will need to be training on how to budget. All right, you have $10,000, don't spend it all in one day, kind of a thing, and make sure that they have line items that they're able to either determine on their own, or if they have a template or a guide from previous years that they may just need to tweak and adjust for the new year. And also if they have any kind of stipend funds or how to track and report funds that have been raised, they need really in-depth training on that kind of processing. And of course, any other reporting that you require, whether that be if they have meetings outside of you in attendance, okay, we need to have meeting or minutes from that meeting, and you need to have those to me within 2 days of that meeting ended so I can stay in the loop and things of that nature. Maybe you're requiring them to copy you or maybe your supervisor on any emails related to the event, so that way you can keep track of what's going on and there's no miscommunication. As we talk about our trainings and the intensity that we're going to have, we do need to remember that there's many different learning styles, 3 in particular, so maybe that's not too many, but many anyway. So as we plan our trainings, keep in mind, there's people who like to be trained using the auditory type of learning, which is just learning by hearing. You have some people who are more visual learners, so they have to see what they're doing. And then you have the tactile or kinesthetic learners who learn by doing. And I've mentioned kind of these guys. I love these little babies and how they visualize the learning styles. And we've talked about these a couple times during the course of this series. But it's important as we start our training or we plan our trainings that we have a mixture as best we can of all 3 of these different types of learning. Training leads to learning. Training leads to learning when it's self-directed, or the person who's going to be our volunteer leader is motivated to share in the responsibilities or helping define their needs of what they need to make the program successful. The leader or training leads to learning when an immediate need needs to be filled. So this is when the motivation to learn is at its highest, when there's not a wait time to start a task, but learning the task and implementing the knowledge that they've learned from training quickly is really going to help a leader be motivated and get what needs to be done. Learning happens when it's experimental or when the learning is active and hands-on and contributes to a shared experience. Also when it's reflective and you allow for time to process, reflect back on the experience, draw some conclusions, and derive some principles from the application. So it may be that we talk about things that we've done in the past. This has worked. Okay, great. I'm going to reflect on what's worked in the past and we're going to keep it going. Well, this didn't work as well, so maybe we're going to eliminate that this year and try something a little bit different. And then our training also acknowledges and builds on prior experiences and skills, so the person feels confident that what they already know is going to help in their learning, and they're also going to learn something new as well. So I love these 2 graphics that I'm about to show you, and it really helps put, at least in my mind, how the different learning styles and how we do our training, and this can go for our training volunteers in our already established roles, as well as our training for volunteers in our volunteer leader roles. And we've talked about these a couple times as well, I think, or at least once. But this is the Edgar Dale's Cone of Experience scale that I've always found helpful. So people generally remember 10% of what they hear, 30% of what they see, 50% of what they see and hear, 70% of what they say or write, and 90% of what when they do something. So as I do these webinar series, I know you guys are probably going to retain about 30 to 50% of what we talk about. I'm setting those expectations because we're not doing a lot of tactile things. I used to do some polls, and now we got a new system, and I'm still trying to figure out how to do those polls and make it a little bit more interactive. But I know you're hearing what I'm saying for the most part. If not, I bet some people's ears perked up like, ooh, I should be paying attention. But I know you're also seeing what I'm saying. And then maybe some of you are taking a couple notes as well. So hopefully this will also kind of trigger in your mind as you're doing your trainings, whether it be virtually or in person, maybe a couple ways to improve upon our trainings. This is a new scale that was in our materials. And of course, I always have the links to any of the resources that we talk about here at the bottom of the page. And they're so incredibly helpful. But people generally are able to apply in practice. So not only how they generally remember, but how they're able to apply what they remember. 10% of what's presented to them, 10% of what is modeled for them, 15% of what they had the opportunity to practice with feedback, and then 80% of what they received ongoing in training to do. So if anything else, I know you guys know how to do tremendous volunteer role descriptions because we talk about that all the time in our ongoing trainings. But I thought that those were really interesting. I'd love to hear in the comment section if you guys think that these things are relevant and it's helped you in any kind of way, but or you'll be using them going forward. I know I'm going to probably post these up in my office here soon. I just think they're very handy. Things aren't always rainbows and sunshine for us as program staff, right? We have our stressful days. We have our, oh my goodness, I will hope this week ends soon because I'm just so overwhelmed with things. So we can't expect every day is going to be perfect for our volunteer leaders either, right? We have to set that expectation that some things are going to go great. Other times some things may be a little chaotic. So this chart that's also in our resources that I thought would be really helpful to look at is some things to consider as possibilities could go awry or things may come up as we do either our daily work or even on the day of an event or a fundraiser. So there aren't enough volunteers. This has happened so many times. So we really have to prioritize our tasks. If we had someone who's supposed to be a greeter and just greet people as they come in, maybe we eliminate that volunteer role and we put them in a different volunteer role that has a higher priority. There aren't enough materials. We've had this happen before, of course. We may have people that we need to do supply runs. So if our volunteer leader is good, we've trained them well, we know that they're going to run the event seamlessly or as seamlessly as they can, we can ditch out for a few minutes and get those extra supplies that are needed or ask another volunteer to do that for us that we trust. Time's up, but the tasks aren't completed. So we've run out of time. Maybe this is just a preparation day to where you're setting up for the event and you only have a limited amount of time that you can do a setup or maybe even a teardown. See if you can recruit people to stay a little bit longer. Hey, I know I asked you guys to only stay until 2 o'clock, but it looks like we're going to need at least another 30 minutes to an hour to complete this setup. Do you mind staying a little bit longer? Or, hey, it looks like we have an extra hour tomorrow morning before the event starts to finish up and do little things. Does anyone mind coming early? Rains during an outdoor project? Always have that backup plan, especially if you're doing something outdoors. That weather may be a factor and have a date in mind to reschedule in advance. Or possibly if there is an indoor location nearby that you can quickly move whatever you were doing outside into an indoor location. Volunteers finish early. A lot of our volunteers are super effective and efficient in what we've asked them to do. So it's okay to send a volunteer home early if they're just standing around doing nothing. The last thing we want to do is for a volunteer to feel like we're wasting their time. Maybe the volunteer finishes their task early, but you don't have enough volunteers for another task. You can switch them over to something different and utilize them that way if they're comfortable. Youth volunteers show up. I know many of our programs, I believe, are 18 and older. So maybe we have a mom who brings her child for an event. Make sure you have policies in place. Talk to your legal team and your supervisor. And maybe there needs to be some kind of consent, like the mom or the parents or dad or grandparents, whoever it may be, that guardian signs that, yes, this volunteer is my responsibility. If something happens, it's not, on the organization. And see if we have any age-appropriate tasks for them. Depending on how young they are, we may or may not have a task. And then another thing that could happen is if we're working with multiple partners on a project and an agency doesn't show up, and they had maybe a huge part of the event was on their shoulders and they didn't show up. We maybe have to determine if the project could still go on or if we need to reschedule, which is probably the worst thing that could possibly happen. But I mean, we have to prepare for the worst. So what's going to be our backup plan if something falls through? So things to also prepare for your training with the volunteer, to say, we hope for the best, but we prepare for the worst, and here's some scenarios that could happen. So this might help us in just our regular everyday activities anyway. I know I haven't thought about some of these in a long time. So our support. So we've selected our person. Our training is complete. We just can't push the leaders into the deep end and see if they can swim, right? We have to be there for them in case anything happens, if they have any questions, need any guidance on how to complete a task. We always have to be there. Once their confidence level increases, however, maybe they just have some basic questions that you're like, we went over this in training. I know we did, but they just wanted to ask it again to build their confidence, make sure they knew the answer. And as their confidence grows, they don't feel like they need us as a crutch as much, and they're going to grow, and in many cases, they're going to exceed our expectations. So kind of just being there in the shadows even, not forcing your opinions on them, but just being there as kind of a soundboard. It's an important thing that we always are there to support them in any way that they need it. Coaching is a great way to start this, and it's an informal method of support. It doesn't have to necessarily be super formal where everything is regulated. It's going to happen throughout all the stages of a project, from the planning to the implementation, and the evaluation at the end. To be successful in a coaching role, it's important to have a trusting, honest, and respectful relationship. So make sure you can work well with this volunteer leader, and you'll probably determine that within the interview as well. If they have kind of some interesting feedback or answers to some questions, you also have to kind of say, will I be able to work with this person in order for them to be successful and us to be successful as well? Clearly define those roles, responsibilities, and expectations. We do that over and over again. Have effective listening skills. Hear them out. Don't interrupt them when they talk. Make sure that they've completed their thought before we put maybe our input in. Ask strategic questions to promote thinking. So, okay, you want to do it that way, but what if this happens? Or have you considered, that's a great idea, have you considered adding this to make it even more effective? And then data collection and thoughtful feedback on the data that they've collected. Delegation is another component of being supportive to our volunteer leaders. So while you're giving volunteer leaders more responsibility, you're still going to work with them very closely, as we've mentioned, and make sure that their goals are met. Keep in mind, if a goal is not met, it's not all on the volunteer. It's also going to be on our shoulders as well, so keep that in mind. Your volunteer's success is your success and vice versa. When delegating a task for a program or a project to the leader, make sure that you give assignments in terms of results and not just an activity or a task. So explain, for example, what they're trying to achieve rather than just giving them something to do. You're making these calls to our community partners to try and raise the $15,000. So there's the reasoning and then the end goal of what they're doing. Be very detailed. Maybe if they have to make calls, you have a script that they can use as kind of guidance. And then as they feel more comfortable, they can kind of go off script and be a little bit more fluid with their communication. Explain the importance of the task and show them that you're confident in their abilities. So maybe you go back to something that they said in the interview. I know you've done this before, so I have complete confidence in you that you'll be able to be successful. And have the confidence in yourself that you've picked the right person to achieve this goal or for the task. Tell the volunteer leaders how much authority they have in making decisions. So many times you're going to be the decision maker, but there may be a couple little things that the volunteer can make a decision on and carry out a task, like the dates that maybe you want to schedule meetings with a committee. If as a volunteer leader is maybe helping with a fundraiser and they have 3 other committee members, instead of you scheduling everything, the volunteer leader may be able to figure out the schedule of the other committee members and do the dates for the scheduling and the time to make sure it's more cohesive for everyone. So little things like that. Major decisions, definitely you're going to need to be the decision maker on that. But little things like that, you might be able to be flexible and really show the volunteer that you have that faith in them. Make resources available and offer any assistance. So allow the proper access to tools and resources to get the job done. Maybe if you're planning an event and you've had people attend in the past, that the leader gets the access to the people who've attended in the past so they can send them the notice that, hey, things are coming up, or we need volunteers for this or that. Determine criteria for success and agree on how results will be judged. So this needs to be established at the beginning of the project for sure and given feedback throughout. So the success is raising that $15,000, and halfway before the event, we're hoping that we get up to $8,000 and really check in that status and seeing how successful we are. And then establish reporting points. Maybe you want to set a time to check in with your leader to monitor any progress. This will avoid having to meet only if something bad happens. So maybe you meet once a month as you're implementing, or maybe once every couple weeks. And then the month leading up to the event, you meet every week just to make sure things are going on schedule. And make sure when you have these meetings with your volunteer leader that they have your undivided attention. These check-ins, they're your main focus. Turn your emails off, have your computer on just in case you need to give resources, but make sure that you are 100% focused on them and their needs. The last thing to be supportive is to recognize our leaders and all their contributions and how valuable they've been in making the project, program, event, whatever it may be, a success. This is also a great retention tool for them to continue their leadership with the project, making it a short-term to a long-term commitment, or maybe if it's an annual event and they were a chair of something, that they come back every year and they want to be the leader for this event. It was successful this year. Our goal was 15. They made 20. Let's keep it going, keep the momentum going. We can do even better next year. It may also be the motivation that another volunteer in the audience needs. If you're, as you're recognizing someone else who is there to witness the recognition, it might be the motivation that they need to step up and apply and be a leader as well, or be on the committee to help make the event more successful for years to come. It's really possible that you're going to get to know a volunteer leader a lot more personally than maybe a volunteer who's in another volunteer role that you have, because you're going to be working so closely with them. Don't hesitate to ask them how they'd like to be recognized, just like you would with any other volunteer. So if they don't want the spotlight put on them, you may not want to give them a big shout out at the event, or do a social media post or have their name all over everything. But it definitely, even if they don't want the spotlight put on them, they definitely need to have some recognition, especially if it's an event or a fundraiser or the end of a project or a program. But they do need to be recognized and given credit for all the work that they did to make everything so successful. We've talked a lot about recognition ideas in the past. We have a couple sessions on our YouTube channel about it. But down here at the bottom, you see all of our resources or the source of all this information. Excuse me. There's a great list in the Volunteers as Leaders Guide that I used for this presentation that gives you a whole list of recognition ideas that I think would be very valuable for everyone to take a look at. In closing, all right, we're already to the end. My goodness, I've kind of blown through this. I apologize. I didn't think I was talking this fast, but maybe I am. So just to kind of recap a little bit, before you get your volunteer leaders on board, you have to get that buy-in from your upper management and the staff that are going to be working with that volunteer. Buy-in is going to be super, super important, especially as the responsibility and the accountability of these volunteer leaders grows and grows. Look at that needs assessment, and it's going to help you determine where and what the volunteer leaders will be able to help with the most. Once this is determined, it'll also help increase the buy-in so everyone's going to see the value in the volunteer leaders and helping take responsibility and accountability for these projects, and maybe, again, taking a little bit of the stress off of us that we have in our day-to-day schedules and tasks and everything that we do. Patience is a virtue that I struggle with, but I'm working on it. But really be patient when selecting the volunteer to fill the leadership role. You want to do a thorough screening, the interview, and make sure you're giving the right person the opportunity to shine. Picking the wrong person will start you back at square one, and really nobody wants that. While the person you pick has a great skill set already in place and already built from their experience, you need to do a thorough and intensive training so the goals and the objectives of the project or program are met. Do your best at incorporating those learning styles, the auditory, visual, and tactile kinesthetic, I think I say that right, I probably don't, that we mentioned, and the tips on how people generally remember and apply what they've learned. Lastly, you're going to be the volunteer leader's biggest cheerleader. If you want them to be successful, you have to show them that you have all the support that they need and that they're going to be successful. Even if they don't have the confidence, you can have the confidence in them. If they're successful, so are we. So we need to give them the tools and resources, the meaningful tasks, and recognition for their hard work, commitment, and impact that they've had on the program or project. And that's all I have in terms of volunteer leadership development. So feel free to, please don't leave, hang out with me for just a little bit longer. But if you have any questions, comments, any tips that you find helpful that you'd love to share with the group, please feel free. We can start to unmute ourselves here in just a little bit, but please feel free to have any comments in the chat box. There's a couple upcoming events and trainings that I want to let you all know about before I let you go for the day. But please feel free to put any feedback in that chat box for me. So a couple conferences that are coming up here relatively soon. So Volunteer Tennessee has their annual Volunteerism and Service Learning Conference that's going to be held February 13th to the 15th of 2022 in Franklin, Tennessee. That's here in Middle Tennessee. I've attended and presented at this conference in the past, and I found it really valuable. Still in the planning stages for the conference, and as I get more information, I'll be sure to pass it along to everyone. But I know that announcements for or call for speaker proposals are going to be coming out here within the next month or two. So if anyone's interested in being a speaker, please visit their website for updates, and I'll be able to send all that out to you all as well. Another conference that's right around the corner is the Tennessee Federation for the Aging, or TFA's, Rising Above Aging with Passion and Purpose conference. That's going to be in Pigeon Forge on October 26th to the 28th, so just coming up here in a couple months. There's going to be a speaker on volunteer engagement. I don't know if Joni Shaver is with us today, but she's going to be presenting on that. I know she's attended in the past. It doesn't look like she's on today with us, but she's going to be our speaker for volunteer management. So please visit the TFA's website for updates on registration. It's going to be opening soon. I'm part of the committee on that, so if you have any questions, actually I'm on the committee for both of these conferences, so a little selfish plug here. If you have questions on either of these conferences, please feel free to let me know. And as you all find any other events or webinars or presentations going on in the communities, please let me know, and I want to share those with the group because we've cut the meeting chat is muted. That's weird. Why is the meeting chat muted? Sorry. I just got notices. New system, new notices. So our last webinar is actually going to be next month, so we're not going to have any sessions October, November, and December. So really having opportunities outside of this series for people to get that continuing education and additional training on volunteer engagement, I think is going to be really valuable to this group. So if you have anything that you hear about, please let me know. A couple things in addition to these conferences is there's a lot of opportunity to recognize our volunteers. And I want you all to consider, if you have the time, to nominate some volunteers for these awards. So for the Volunteer Tennessee's Volunteerism and Service Learning Conference, they do the Governor Star Awards ceremony every year, and that's going to be held on Sunday, February 13th. So volunteer coordinators from all over the state nominate outstanding volunteers in their counties to receive this award. One volunteer from all 95 counties is selected. I encourage you all to nominate at least one of your volunteers, if not more, for an award. Even if you're only focused in one county, you can do multiple nominations. If you have a region and you have volunteers in multiple counties, wonderful. Applications aren't open just yet. They're going to open up in the fall, but I wanted to keep you all to have this recognition opportunity kind of in the back of your mind and maybe start thinking about the volunteers you want to nominate. I know myself and some of the master trainers for the SAIL program that I coordinated, we nominated 8 of our volunteers for the 2020 awards, and 3 of them were selected. So it is possible. A couple other awards that are coming up. This one's at the Tennessee Federation for the Aging Conference. They do the Lena Mae Pickens Volunteer Award, and you can see kind of in this picture, this is Dan Porter from Decatur County. He was given the award. Can you copy this nomination link to the chat? I sure can, but I will do that when I'm done with the presentation. Sorry. But yes, Kristen, I will definitely be sure to do that. So again, I encourage you all to not only nominate volunteers for Governor Stars, but also the Lena Mae Pickens Award. And they will be asked to come to Pigeon Forge, and if needed, maybe possibly if in the budget some of the expenses could be paid or reimbursed for a nominee or someone who's receiving that award. We also have 3 Aging Innovation Awards. So one award goes to each of the 3 grand regions of the state. So not only is this a great way to recognize a volunteer, but also for you all to nominate yourselves in some cases. And don't feel weird about doing that. You guys are doing great work. Nominate yourself. Get yourself some recognition for your amazing work. But we can be recognized for our creativities for those projects and programs that we've developed and implemented during this crazy year. So this first picture is the Knox County Sheriff's Department, who won 1 year for the East Tennessee region. We have here the Lawrence County Senior Center won 1 year for Middle Tennessee, and then Chester County Senior Center won for West Tennessee. Applications for these particular awards are due September 1st, so the deadline is quickly approaching. And just like Kristen asked, I will be sure to send the links and put those in the chat for you all to access. And I will also include that in my follow-up email I send to you all this afternoon with the recording and other materials, so you guys can have those resources to be able to do your nominations. Absolutely. And that's all I have in terms of updates. Just a quick friendly reminder, our last webinar for 2021, how crazy is that? This year has flown by, is going to be Thursday, September 16th, same time, possibly same place, depending on where you're at. And we're going to talk about why volunteers leave. And to also put another, a more positive spin on this, we'll also be talking about how we can get them to stay as well. So kind of instead of focusing on only why they leave, we'll figure out our remedies on how to get them to stay so they don't leave. Also, we are going to continue this series into 2022. As long as you all want me to do that, that's the plan, unless people just say, nope, we don't want it anymore. But that's not the feedback I've been getting, thankfully. So please start thinking about topics that you'd like to see discussed during the series in 2022. And I'm going to be sending probably a survey of some kind to get some feedback from people who've attended the series to see what they're interested in. And also looking for guest speakers. We had a couple of those at the beginning of the year that we had some really positive feedback and input on. So looking for even more guest speakers to get more points of views from maybe even across the country or even here in the state. So if you're interested in presenting on a particular topic, please let me know and we'll get you on the calendar for 2022. As always, thank you all so much for joining me each month and helping me live out my dream of working with volunteers and all of you amazing coordinators across the state. If you ever need anything from me, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm always here for you and I'll help you in any way that I can. And until next time, I hope you all stay safe. Have a great rest of the week and weekend. And I'm going to stick around for any more questions. I didn't see anything come in through the chat box. And I will put those links in the chat box for you, Kristen, and also send that in the follow-up. But thank you all so much for joining. I really, really appreciate it.